Dober Dan to my Russian and Serbian friends, and I have a surprise for you. This is Miss Jill Louise Starr, and if you hate Bill Clinton as much as I do, well, this is your lucky day because we're going to be reading Bill Clinton's official and authentic I Want to Dodge the Vietnam Draft, and I Don't Want to Be an Army Officer in the Vietnam War letter. Mr. Clinton, who both sad and ironically was Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Army when he was president, didn't have any military experience whatsoever when he was president. I've always been one to hold the strongly held belief that nobody should run for president. Nobody has the right to run for United States president if they do not have any U.S. military experience in their background, because they have no right being the commander-in-chief of the most powerful army in the world that uses nuclear and atomic weapons and has them at their disposal, as did Bill Clinton at the time, when they have no military experience. Bill Clinton not only had no military experience, he, quote, says to us in this letter, in his own words, quote, he loathes and hates the U.S. military, yet he had the audacity and nerve to become U.S. president, and that's probably why he made the stupid and illegal move of bombing the former Yugoslavia without United Nations Security Council approval first. So let's read what Bill Clinton wrote in his letter. And he wrote this letter on December 3rd, 1969. Bill Clinton then was in his second term as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University in England. He wrote this letter to Colonel Eugene Holmes, who headed up the Reserve Officers Training Corps program at the University of Arkansas, where Bill Clinton was living before he went to England at that time. Here's the full text and the authentic letter. A small note, after the letter below, there's also an official transcript that was taken on February 1992 on Nightline, a program in which Governor Bill Clinton discussed his controversial letter with Ted Koppel. I won't be reading that, but you're welcome to read that on my blog. Bill Clinton states, and let's read the letter, quote, I loathe the United States military. Dear Colonel Holmes, I am so sorry to be long in writing you. I know I promised to let you hear from me at least once a month, and from now on you will. But I have needed time to take time this summer to think over this letter almost daily since my return to England, and what I ought to be writing and what I should have said to you on this letter. First, I want to say thank you, not only for saving me from the Vietnam draft, but also for your kindness and for you being so decent to me last summer when I was at a very low point, one of the lowest points I've ever been at ever in my life. One thing which made me and the bond between you and me struck in good faith somewhat palatable to me was my high regard for you personally. In retrospect, it seems that the admiration might not have been mutual had you personally known a little more about me and my political views and activities when we first met. At least now you might think more of me, for at least I'm admitting to you what I thought of then of the ROTC. Let me explain it to you now. As you know, I worked for 2 years in a very minor position in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I did it for the experience and for the salary, but also for the opportunity, however small, of working every day against a war I opposed and a war, the Vietnam War, that I despised with a depth of feeling I had reserved solely for racism in America before the Vietnam War began, period. I did not take the matter lightly, but studied it carefully, and there was a time when not many people had more information about Vietnam than I did working on the Senate committee, period. I have written and I have spoken, and I have even marched against the Vietnam War, period. One of the national organizers, I was even one of the national organizers, Bill Clinton says. of the Vietnam moratorium, and so is a close friend of mine. After I left Arkansas last summer, I went to Washington to work in the national headquarters of the moratorium to stop the Vietnam War, then to England to organize Americans in England for more demonstrations here on October 15th and November 16th to stop the Vietnam War. There apparently is a video here. I don't have a copy of it. After 1 week of answering questions about allegations of myself dodging the draft, and 1 week before the New Hampshire primary, this letter surfaced, in which the young Bill Clinton thanked Colonel Holmes for, quote, saving him from the draft and becoming an Army officer in Vietnam. Bill Clinton then tries to defend the letter and answers questions on his motives and his accusers on 2/12/1992. It says here something that this was stated in Hilo, Hawaii. It says, interlocked with the war is the draft issue, which I did not begin to consider, Bill Clinton says, separately until early 1968. For a law seminar at Georgetown, I wrote a paper on the legal arguments for and against the war, allowing, with the selective service system, the classification of selective consciousness objection for those opposed to participate in the war, not simply to quote participation in the war in any form, end quote. And then Ted Koppel, Bill Clinton tries to defend himself on Nightline with Ted Koppel, and Ted Koppel states, tonight we're having a conversation with Governor Bill Clinton. This is ABC's News Nightline, reporting from Washington with Ted Koppel. Ted Koppel states, quote, before this broadcast is over, I will have read to you the entire text of a 22-year-old letter, which was written by 23-year-old Bill Clinton. It is, as Governor Clinton himself described it today, an account of a conflicted and thoughtful young man himself. It is quite a remarkable letter, actually. It is very eloquent and very revealing. Many of you will hear it and find it in a reformation of everything you like and admire about Bill Clinton. Others among you will be angered by what you hear. It is safe to assume that those among you who leaked the letter to us in Nightline and our colleagues at World News Tonight did not do it in the expectation, however, that this letter would help the Clinton campaign. Of course, you leaked it to hurt it. As the governor noted earlier in the day, presidential politics is a contact sport. Having said that, it is also clear that the Bill Clinton campaign feels that the leaking of this letter just days before the New Hampshire primary is a low blow to him personally. Well, of course it is. A quick summary now from Nightline correspondent Mr. Greenfield, Jeff, on Governor Bill Clinton, Democratic presidential candidate. Mr. Jeff Greenfield from ABC News states, quote, Bill Clinton was talking about the leak of the letter he had written more than 22 years ago, filled with a young man's anguish and hate about a war, the Vietnam War in Vietnam, and the draft. But as the governor of Arkansas, he faced this room full of reporters today. He might have been asking himself, quote, how did I get in here, and how did this happen? For months, Bill Clinton's presidential campaign had been a textbook model. He had been on a roll, at least since last November, when a speech in Chicago had vowed the state party chairs and the political press with its broadly appealing message to the public of passion and personal responsibility. Governor Clinton, 1923-1991, said, quote, most people are worried about keeping body and soul together, and they are asking, quote, since I played the rules and I paid the taxes, I did the work, I sent my kids into war, why did I try to get away from the war myself? And it is those questions that I will have to answer to if I were to win the election in 1992, end quote. Then Jeff Greenfield responds, he won the money for the primary, far outstripping his rivals, referring to Bill Clinton, in raising campaign funds. He had won the media primary with magazine covers all over printing his face. And earlier this year, the polls were showing Bill Clinton, the 45-year-old now, sprinting to a huge lead in the New Hampshire primary. But is he going to win it now that this letter was late? Norman Ornstein from the American Enterprise Institute states, quote, "It became extremely clear well before the first of the year that Bill Clinton had thought through what it meant to be president. He had all the answers of all those significant questions about issues. He had the kind of message that would likely make him electable if he had won the nomination, if not for this letter." Jeff Greenfield then responds, quote, "Even the widely publicized charges of marital infidelity, publicized charges of Bill Clinton's marital infidelity with Monica Lewinsky, a young White House intern who he confessed to gave him oral sex in the Oval Office 3 weeks ago, did not derail this campaign. But when the Wall Street Journal last week charged that Bill Clinton had received a Vietnam draft deferment from an ROTC program he never joined, his ground seemed to shift politically." Mr. Ornstein then says, "Members of the same political class that 2 months ago were saying this guy is a winner now seriously questions his electability in general." Greenfield states, quote, "Bill Clinton has long acknowledged his opposition to the Vietnam War. As a Rhodes Scholar in England, he helped organize an anti-war protest in November of 1969. But he also said that he loathes the U.S. military in general. He also stated that he has doubts about the morality of the war and the selective service of the United States system in general, which led him to write and abandon the ROTC, the idea of the draft itself, and brought him to write the letter. Only the luck of the draw, the high lottery number, kept him out. One of his friends from his Oxford days strongly backs Clinton's story. Mike Mendelbaum, his campaign advisor at the time, states about Bill Clinton, quote, the recollection of people who knew Bill Clinton well at that time in 1969, who were with him every day, was that when Bill Clinton arrived in Oxford in the fall of 1999, he expected that he would be drafted. He was so uncertain about his future, and he was so uncertain about how much of the year he would be able to complete Oxford that he did not even rent another room for himself for the following semester. He lived with friends instead." Mr. Greenfield followed in a statement stating, quote, "But fairly or not, the issue has clearly hurt his campaign." Mandy Grunwald, Bill Clinton's political consultant, states, "Certainly the fact that most people just met Bill Clinton recently makes it more difficult for them to deal with his letter, dodging the Vietnam draft. They don't know about his career. They don't know about a lifetime of dealing with many of his interesting lifetime issues, about possibly using illegal drugs also. Although he said, quote, he didn't have marijuana. Many state he did. They don't know about the kind of things Bill Clinton seems that many people don't like that he did about a dozen years ago or so in the government." Mr. Greenfield then states, quote, "Now Bill Clinton has taken to the airways, urging New Hampshire voters to send out a clear message that they should vote for him. Bill Clinton has a campaign commercial stating, quote, now there are those who want to divide and distract us from what really is important, but I trust the people of New Hampshire will reject that kind of negative politics." But was that just negative politics? I think what the negative politics really are is Bill Clinton, a man who wants to be the commander-in-chief of the United States military, that dodged the draft and says, quote, "I loathe the U.S. military." That's what I call negative politics, Mr. Bill Clinton, and I personally hate you for bombing from Yugoslavia. Mr. Jeff Greenfield then states, quote, "Even before the first primary vote has been cast, Bill Clinton has already been through 2 acts of any presidential campaign and the, quote, gee whiz stage, and from the, quote, wait a minute stage. The outcome of the 3rd act, the end of the primary, will almost certainly determine his political fate. I am Jeff Greenfield for Nightline. Good night." And then Ted Koppel takes over. Quote, he states, "As I told you just before we went on the air, we have of late a letter of Bill Clinton stating he rose up the military and dodging the Vietnam War as a military officer. Tracking polls from the Boston Globe and television station WBZ, we are going to take a look at that poll right now. And if you look at our screen, which I can't see now, you will see that a few days ago it was different than it was now." And Bill Clinton states, yes, it is different. It has gone down. The polls with me have gone down, Bill Clinton states. The couple says, "Okay, Mr. Clinton, a few days ago, on February 8th, you were still showing 28%, and Senator Songas was showing 25%. As of today, Songas is up to 30%, and you're down 20%, 19% at least. Do you attribute that to the letter that was leaked by the Wall Street Journal Starr story, which first raised this draft issue?" Governor Clinton states, quote, "Well, I think of that often, and then comments over the weekend and everything that was said on television. When I was not in New Hampshire, I was at home trying to get over the flu, and there were a lot of press reports over the weekend saying, quote, well, this raises questions about Bill Clinton's electability and questions about his character in general, unquote. And I think a lot of people heard it from it secondhand. I should have put an end to it right away as soon as the Wall Street Journal story broke, but I didn't. That was my fault, and I was wrong. The Wall Street Journal story itself confirmed what I said all along, which is that I gave up my draft deferment before the lottery for me came up to be an officer. I was in the draft, yes. It was the luck of the draw that I was struck a high lottery number. I did not dodge the draft, however, although your letter did say differently, Mr. Clinton. I did not want to do anything wrong, that was all. And that has been contradicted by many people." Koppel states, "I have to assume that when you were not campaigning and pressing the flesh today, that you and your advisors had been just sitting around then and saying, quote, we do determine, how do we determine and turn this thing around now that everybody knows that I've avoided the dodge and tried to dodge the Vietnam War in the draft? How do we take a campaign that clearly has been dealt a body blow and put it back on track again?" Governor Clinton states, "Well, I thought frankly about that a lot, Koppel, and we bottomed out a couple of days ago. And sometimes these polls drag a little bit when you hit rock bottom. Frankly, I've been amazed at the number of my supporters that stayed with me in New Hampshire and the number of people who've loved to stay with me today. I mean, after all, they just met me a few months ago, or even a few days ago, and they still say they're going to vote with me and stay with me in the New Hampshire primaries." This goes on, and then Ted Koppel reads Bill Clinton's full draft letter. Koppel says, "Governor Clinton, I promised you this morning that I would tell our audience tonight what I told you when I spoke to you on the phone this morning at 9 a.m., namely that while I could not reveal the source who gave us a copy of this letter, that it was my impression this morning that our source had gotten it from someone at the Pentagon itself, period. I must also tell you that I got a call from the source at the Pentagon after your press conference this morning in New Hampshire, in which that person at the Pentagon told me that indeed it had come from the Pentagon. This letter did indeed come from the Pentagon, and he put us on to a couple of other clues, and we followed up on his clues at the Pentagon during the course of today. And just to bring the audience this evening fully up to date, I want you to know that I did call late afternoon, and I want to bring you up to date on who we called. Whoops. Given the information that was given us this afternoon from the Pentagon, it was the fact that from World News Tonight got its information from Colonel Eugene Holmes, who was an aide to the head of the ROTC at the University of Arkansas, Do you still feel that the Bush administration bears any burden of responsibility for the release of the letter, Mr. Clinton? Governor Clinton responds, I really have no idea, Mr. Koppel. I don't know what the source of the leak of this letter or where it came from was, so I can't comment on that. I think that the important thing is that the letter is consistent with everything I've been saying for the last 13 years. Since I was first asked about it in the late 1978, I was in the draft before the lottery came up. I gave up the deferment. I got a high lottery number, and I wasn't called. That wasn't the records. That is what the records reflect. A Republican member of my draft board was given an affidavit in the last days of days saying that I did not dodge the draft, although it says in the letter that I did. Ted Koppel states, as I told you, whoops, I already said that. Let's see. Koppel says, all right, Governor Clinton, we're going to take a small break, and when we come back, we're going to hear the entire letter that you wrote yourself more than 22 years ago this evening. Then there's a small break. Ted Koppel states, that Governor Bill Clinton, I promised you this morning that I would tell our audience, and he goes on. Koppel says, Mr. Bill Clinton, if we were electing you 23 years ago, and we weren't, we're electing you tonight, what Colonel Holmes said about you and felt you at that time would be germane, but it is germane now. However, it is what the 45 or 46-year-old Bill Clinton thinks and what he thought then. He says he loathed the U.S. military. And what you said at that time felt perhaps should have a bearing on the election now. Bill Clinton states, I have somewhat different feelings about that now. I did loathe the U.S. military, but now I think we ought to have the draft, and I'm actually for the draft. I even believe that people should volunteer themselves for the Army in and of itself. I do think when you have a general draft, at least there ought to be at least a declaration of war. Now, it's very interesting, Bill Clinton says this. He says, quote, Bill Clinton says this, now listen, quote, I do think when there is a general draft and a war, there should be a general declaration of war. But now when Bill Clinton bombed the former Yugoslavia, he broke the War Powers Act. That was written after the Vietnam War in 1973. And Senator Campbell, a Republican, in fact, was one of the many that sued Bill Clinton for bombing the former Yugoslavia unilaterally without United Nations Security Council approval prior, because Bill Clinton did not have Congress declare war. Another illegality that we are finding out now about Mr. Clinton, because for over 3 months, after 3 months, it is by constitutional law, Congress must make a full declaration of aggression or war to continue a war. And there was aggression and war against the former Yugoslavia, but Bill Clinton clearly did not ask the Congress to make a full declaration of war, but yet Bill Clinton continued to bomb the former Yugoslavia. What else does Bill Clinton have to say? I'm going to have to cut this short, but I will continue this evening. So thank you for joining me, and for you Bill Clinton haters, we're up one and he's down all.